Good evening, my name is Rich Biamno. I'm the Technical Services Director for the Town of Yarmouth. Thanks for coming to the first Water Resources Advisory Committee. We have these microphones here. Cape Media Center, this is Mark. He's videotaping the meeting for our records and for public consumption later on. So if we speak into the microphones, that'll help with the volume and the audio. At this point, I'm just going to turn it over to Dave Young to run through the agenda and his presentation. And if you have any questions, let me know. Go to Dave.
All right, thank you, Rich. Did you want to go right into the presentation then, or do you want to do the organization?
No, let's go into the agenda as we have it.
Yeah, what about introduction?
Yep. All right, we'll do the introductions, go around the table. My name is David Young with CDM Smith. I've been working on wastewater planning here in Yarmouth since I think 2001. So I have a little bit of background, but look forward to working with you, all you folks to help craft the next version of the recommended program.
Kara Johnson, also with CDM Smith, and have been working on the plan as well.
My name is Lisa Cody, and I manage the circle of politics at Yarmouth. And I'm also a pretty big environmentalist.
I'm John Liaison, newly appointed member to the committee.
Robert Angel, also the Yarmouth, from the Yarmouth Board, or the Yarmouth and Northside representative appointed to the committee. My history is, I was born here, been here forever, been through this several times, started in 1966, and looking forward to working with you folks and presenting the public with a good plan.
Rich Biamno, the Technical Services Director for the Town of Yarmouth. I'm one of the staff appointed to the committee to help support your efforts.
Tom Roach, Bass River Watershed representative.
Lee Rowley from Yarmouth. I'm also a representative from the planning committee in Yarmouth. And I have an engineering background.
My name is Tom Durkin. I represent the Conservation Commission. I had the pleasure of meeting with Dave often on the Wastewater Implementation Committee, which met starting in 2011. I think we decided, wasn't it, Dave? Nice to see you.
I'm Rainey Hammond. I'm a member at large, and I'm a land use permitting paralegal. I do land use permitting, so my background is in the regulation side of it.
I'm Kurt Sears, I'm a master plumber, also a lifer here on Cape Cod.
And I'm Jeff Colby, the Public Works Director here in Yarmouth, and here to support the committee. And to that extent, we have Jocelyn Radio sitting against the wall there. She will be taking the minutes for the meeting and has graciously accepted that responsibility going forward. So you'll be seeing her at the meeting.
Well, welcome everybody. We don't want to forget Tom Barron sitting back there and his interest in the program. The next item is to establish committee organization. I presume that means a chair or vice chair. Is there anyone who would like to throw their name in the hat to become chair of the committee? We see one, Kurt.
If anybody else wants to, it wouldn't hurt my feelings though.
Anyone else have an interest? Does anyone want to make a motion?
I make a motion to nominate Kurt Sears as chairman.
Second.
Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Congratulations, Mr. Chairman. Do you want to do a vice chair in case you're not here?
Absolutely. Any volunteers?
I'd like to nominate Lee Rowley, planning board representative, as vice chair.
Thanks, Tom.
Anybody else? Do we have a second to that nomination?
I'll second.
Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
That's done. Do we need a secretary or what? Or not?
If she's taking
Yeah,
minutes.
I don't think we have to because we're going to support the committee that way. So.
Okay, that's good. meeting schedule. It's always good to try to put meetings out there. I often encourage trying to pick, at least if you're going to meet monthly, which I would recommend you try to do at least initially, to pick a standard day of the month type of thing. Just from our schedules, I'm going to toss out the second Thursdays of the month, but that's just to get the discussion started.
And I was also going to suggest and some feedback that perhaps an off Tuesday, off of Board of Selectmen meeting nights.
Yeah, Thursday, about half the year, Thursday's a tough one.
Okay?
Thursday is the day that the Conservation Commission meets.
Okay?
And Wednesday is planning board. Right?
Yes.
I'm
So
good with
is it
Tuesday.
Monday or Tuesday? Is Monday a problem for you, or is it better on Tuesday because you get money for prep time if you need it? It doesn't not matter.
The off Tuesdays would be good. The only reason I didn't suggest Monday or Tuesday is that's often selectmen's meetings nights, but.
Tuesdays.
So do they have a set second and fourth or something?
Yeah, depends on holidays and other business, I believe.
Sometimes shifts, but
And there may still be some conflicts, because I believe when they get busy in the budget season, they probably meet more than twice a month.
Right.
So for a small period of time, they're probably going to be conflicting with us anyways.
The second week, I think, is better than the first week of the month. Tuesdays are good, but
Yep.
Wednesdays planning meetings on usually the first and third Wednesdays.
So you want to propose the second Tuesday of the month for now? See how it goes?
Let's try that.
Because we adjust if we have to.
Dave, we have a meeting coming up on is it the 23rd?
25th.
Yeah.
Is that the 13th of November will be the next meeting? Second Tuesday in November?
The selectmen wouldn't meet anyways because of the holiday on that particular day, I believe.
I think you're right.
Right, isn't it a Monday holiday?
Yes.
Yes. For some.
For some, yes.
For the town of Yarmouth, yes.
So do I Columbus Day. Okay.
So at the same time,
6:30?
6:30 work best? 6?
6 would be good.
Okay, 6:30.
I think we did 6:30 because something.
I had to be late, yeah, a little bit late today, but
6 okay for you?
6 is fine.
Mark?
Mr. Chairman, I'll get back to you with some room availabilities and so we can post the meetings and give you an appropriate room.
But it might be likely that the hearing room's available if it's off select.
Correct.
Right, good.
Right.
Why is Yarmouth doing this? Number 4, right?
yeah.
6
Okay, keep the meeting moving. We'd like to welcome Selectman Mark Forrest, who I believe is the liaison to this committee. Welcome, Mark.
Good evening.
Chairman Sears has already opened the meeting.
It's nice to see you, Chairman Sears.
Thank you, sir.
What we have prepared, because I know some of you, I know well enough to say if I say Tom, 3 people are going to stand up and say hello. But I thought I would start with somewhat of a little education process, because I know some of this is probably new to you. Feel free as I go through this to ask questions. But I've tried to give sort of the Reader's Digest version of what's been done, or why you're doing this, what's been done, and where you are today, with various discussions and goings-on. To give you a flavor for, 1, what's in front of you as a committee, and 2, lay out a little bit of a timeline for, as I understand it, what the town is looking for you to do. So with that, I'll start in unless somebody has something else they'd like to raise at this point. Anything you want to say, Mark?
I don't know, is this a For recording purposes?
Yes.
Not for, okay. No, I just wanted to, on behalf of the full board, thank everybody for signing up for this and for being part of this initiative. I've, as the sort of the select board liaison, I've taken a lot of interest in water quality issues here in Yarmouth, as obviously we all have. We've been through this enterprise once before. There are people that are on this committee that I think have a lot to share with us to help us understand the challenges that we face in terms of not only developing a plan, but also winning public support. My own observation is that for the town to embrace this, the town has to feel that it has a vested interest in it, that it's a community initiative. I think our challenge last time in going to town meeting, I was there, many of you were there as well. I think the problem was that just a lack of community involvement, the lack of, and that's not for lack of trying, by the way. It's not an easy thing to get the community engaged in something like this. And I've learned that from my own experience working in various communities, that sometimes it takes an enormous amount of work. We can have a lot of open meetings, we can have a lot of open discussions, but in some cases, I have found from my own experiences, sometimes it means knocking on doors, going to places, going to the Rotary clubs, going to all the various community groups, getting in front of people and finding ways to get them engaged and get them to take an interest in this. So as we go forward, I certainly want to offer my help, my support, whatever I can do to help you be successful in this. I know it's not, when I talk to just about everybody here, I think everyone knew that this was going to be a bit of a challenge. And I do very much appreciate your stepping up because it's an important one, and I think it's one that we can be successful in. So once again, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mark. With that, I'll kick off the presentation then. Again, our goal, CDM Smith's goal, is for every one of you to be able to give this presentation in the very near future. Particularly when, as Selectman Forrest said, there's going to be a lot of education going on here. So hopefully as we move along, you'll be educated enough to the issues to be able to go and present to others in the community so that they're hearing from you. Not hearing from us, hearing from you. This is your plan. This isn't CDM Smith's plan. So what I'd like to cover is why is Yarmouth doing this water resources planning effort? It's not just wastewater, as you'll hear. It's truly water resources. What have you done? What needs to be done? And how do we propose to do that or get there? I always like to start with pictures, because pictures tell more than the words that I could give you. If you look at this on the left, back in 1950, 1951, all you got to do is look at the colors. Green meant it was undeveloped, and the yellows, reds mean higher intensity development. If you look over on the right-hand side, 50, 60 years later, there's been quite a change. And so that's why we need to do this planning effort, because Yarmouth has changed. And a lot of that is all on what you'll hear is on-site septic systems, which has created a nitrogen issue here in town that needs to be addressed. Just look at the colors, you can pretty much tell where the highways and the main roads are in town, and that's where the development that has occurred. This is truly a water resources committee. This is a water resources program that you'll be developing. It addresses water quality, mainly in saltwater estuaries, but we also did look at, in the past, some freshwater ponds, and we'll talk about that. We've looked at your 20-plus drinking water wells here in town, which you rely on for your public water system. We've looked at the different beaches, harbors, estuaries, as well as economic development, particularly along the Route 28 Station Avenue corridor. These are pictures here in Yarmouth. The issue is here. It's not something we're projecting to happen. It's already happening. So you can see the impacts from the nitrogen that has degraded the waters here in Yarmouth. Some of you may have heard of a so-called 208 plan. The Cape Cod Commission was tasked by EPA and the Department of Environmental Protection with updating what's known as a 208 plan. What is 208? It just refers to the section of the Federal Clean Water Act. And that's what they've updated. And as part of that, they were directed to create a plan back in 1978, but they needed to update that plan. It had not been updated since then. The state gave them $3 million to do that program, and it focused on sort of today's issues, meaning nitrogen, versus the prior plan was more on where Title V systems couldn't be put in due to high groundwater, poor soil conditions, small lots. We're into nitrogen issues as well as those other traditional Title V. Why are we talking about that? Well, too much nitrogen creates, or N for nitrogen, salt water, P, phosphorus, fresh water. So if you keep those two pathways, that'll help you keep things simple. But in either case, if you have too much, known as nutrients, in a freshwater or saltwater body, you end up with nuisance algae in that water body, which ends up depleting the water quality of that, and we'll depict that in the next couple slides. That degraded water quality ends up in fish kills and other things, as you just saw in the two photos we showed you. And what does that do? Well, it ends up in lowering property values, impacting tourism, and impacting your whole economic climate. So as I said, if we have too much of a nutrient in a freshwater body, this is the one we want. We want to have an acceptable level so that we have a healthy water climate. We're able to get the sunlight that can penetrate through the water. We don't have algae blocking it. We get a healthy fish and other shellfish and other things growing in the water body. Eelgrass, this depicts eelgrass. Think of that as the canary in the mine. While it depicts a healthy water environment, it also is an indicator of whether you're getting degraded water quality. So if you start to lose eelgrass, you're starting to get a degraded water quality. And if we do that, then this is what happens. If we get too much algae in that water body, because we've got too much nitrogen in salt water or too much phosphorus in the fresh water, then we end up blocking the sunlight and degrading the water quality, use up the oxygen, things die off, and you end up with a benthic mat down on the bottom, which doesn't allow for organisms and other things to grow there. So it's a negative cycle that we don't want to get into. Some of you may have heard of the MEP. What does MEP mean? It means the Massachusetts Estuaries Project. They were hired by the Department of Environmental Quality, the School for Marine Science and Technology at UMass Dartmouth, did the MEP studies. They evaluated the how much nutrients can go into the estuaries here on the Cape. And then they came back with and said, what's an acceptable level? So they've done that for the main watersheds here in Yarmouth, as well as many other communities on the Cape. That work has been third-party peer reviewed. And so we now know what level is acceptable, and anything above that we need to remove. So that's what you'll hear about in the work that has been done to date. This is a picture that depicts, you heard me just say the word watershed. A watershed means that a droplet of water that falls here or here is falling in what's known as the Lewis Bay watershed, which means it flows out into this estuary. Similarly, if water drops here or here, it's in the Parkers River watershed and outlets through these ponds down through the Parkers River watershed. And then the Bass River watershed, which goes way up here, which you share almost 50-50 with Dennis, same thing. So those are the three main watersheds that you're going to hear us talk about: Lewis Bay, Parkers River, and Bass River. Now, there are some other watersheds in town, and this shows the sub-watersheds. But if I look at what's known as the Nantucket Sound watershed, this area right here, the reason we're not going to spend as much time on that is because the droplet of water here or here flows out directly into Nantucket Sound, versus these others flow into what's known as an impaired watershed. This is following Bass River, which you'll see in a couple slides, depicts it a little bit better. Why are we focusing on nitrogen? Because this is the standard Title V septic system that most of the homes and businesses here in Yarmouth rely on. There's a few package plants, meaning smaller scale on-site treatment plants. You have a few innovative alternative, I think it's a little over 100 systems here in town. But vast majority, you rely on what's known as a standard Title V septic system. So the waste comes out of the home, toilets flush, dishwasher, whatever, solids are settled out, and the liquid portion flows to a leaching system. Well, that leaching system flows into the soil, has nitrogen in it, and ultimately hits the groundwater table, which is flowing towards a pond or saltwater estuary. Now the difference is nitrogen will move in that soil, it will move in the groundwater table. Phosphorus will tend to be absorbed at least for a certain distance in the soil, so it may not travel all the way to the pond, depending on the soil type and how far away the pond is. So again, nitrogen is the key nutrient that we're talking about. Just to give you a little fact as to impacts from the Cape, this was taken from a slide from a dentist presentation, but Cape Cod represents 4% of the state's population, but you have over 20% of the Title V septic systems. So what that really tells you is that the Cape is heavily dependent on Title V septic systems. Off Cape doesn't have as many, at least as a percentage basis. Particularly, sort of the 495 belt in towards Boston. When you get into Western Mass, that's when you start to get back into the Title V systems again. But they're not impacting saltwater estuaries out there. So that's why the focus here. This is a pie chart that just depicts what we refer to as the three main controllable sources of nitrogen. Pretty clear from which one is the one that we need to focus on. 85% comes from the wastewater or the Title V septic systems. But it doesn't mean we want to ignore stormwater runoff, which is in the 7 to 8% range, or fertilizer, over-fertilization, which then can run off into the estuaries as well, which is another 7 to 8%. But clearly, when you have to remove nitrogen, this is the key that we want to focus on. As I pointed out earlier, you've got the Lewis Bay watershed, which you actually share with the town of Barnstable. So this is the full watershed. But this is your portion in Yarmouth. Parker's River is fully within Yarmouth. And then you have the Bass River watershed, which you share 53%, 47% with the town of Dennis. Now the numbers shown up there, this depicts how much septic system nitrogen you need to remove to restore that watershed back to a healthy environment. And that's based off that MEP or Mass Estuaries Project report work. Parker's River, 96%, but as recommended in the earlier approved Comprehensive Wastewater Management Plan, known as the CWMP, you're all going to become acronym crazy by the time you're done on this committee. We recommended widening the bridge here on Route 28, which the town is in the process of implementing. And what that does is it allows more flushing up and down into Seine Pond, Long Pond, whichever you choose to call. So that 96% drops down to about 67%, because It's not that we're losing nitrogen, it's you have less residence time up here to create that algae and that poor water quality environment because you're increasing the flushing. So that's why that number drops. And then over Bass River, roughly 60%. I don't expect you to be able to read all of this, but this is a matrix that comes out of that 208 plan that we spoke about that the Cape Cod Commission had done. What they did is they looked at sort of the whole host of options that could be looked at to solve the nutrient issues in the communities. Now the reason I want to bring this up is really to look at the X and Y axis. This is if you want to reduce nitrogen. These are the types of things you'd look at. This is if you wanted to remediate it after it's already gotten into the groundwater. And this is if you want to do restoration because the water quality has already become degraded. So that's how they look at that one. And then they look at a scale of if you wanted to do it on lot, meaning where it's occurring. If you wanted to do a neighborhood solution, smaller scale, or if you wanted to do a watershed based, meaning that full watershed that we just looked at, or they looked at Cape-wide. So then when they go to look at different options, so if you wanted to reduce it, and you wanted to do it on a neighborhood scale, you might look at a small, what they refer to as a satellite, what I call a package treatment plant. So you could look at it on that basis. If you wanted to look at it to remediate something that's happened and do it on a neighborhood basis, you could look at what's known as a permeable or active barrier, and I'll show you some pictures of that in a couple slides. So this is just a way of trying to look at what potential solutions might be to address the nutrient issue in a certain area. So you saw a minute ago on the slide for the watersheds that we need to remove up to 80, potentially 90% reduction in nitrogen. Well, a standard Title V system is in the 15 to 20% range if you have ideal soil conditions. Doesn't always occur here, particularly with the coarser sands that we tend to have here on the Cape. If you have an innovative alternative known as IA, it's really a small little treatment plant that's on everybody's lot. You can get up maybe the 35–40% range. So we often get the question of why don't we just require everyone in Yarmouth to put an innovative alternative system on their lot, be done with it, don't get the town involved. That's our solution. Well, if we have to remove 67 to 80% of the nitrogen, putting that in isn't going to get us there. It's not enough nitrogen removal. So then we might have to look at more of a neighborhood, cluster, satellite, package treatment plant. Because it's smaller, it's more susceptible to flow swings, the food source, waste coming in. It doesn't quite have, it's better than an on-site system, but it doesn't quite get what a more centralized, larger scale treatment plant can get, which is up in the 90+%. So this 70%, that might work in certain areas. And that's why you see some some of your hotels, motels here, some of your restaurants have small package plants. So they're removing about 70% of the nitrogen. But again, that's not going to get us there in some of the watersheds that we're looking at. So some of the focus in the past, in the plan that's been developed previously, had focused more on a centralized system because that's where we can get the most efficient nitrogen removal. This is a picture of floating bag system for aquaculture. You are actually doing some aquaculture with the town of Dennis on the Bass River. You received some grants. So you are doing some of that. Town of Dennis in Swan Pond is looking to do this similar program. There's some other communities on the Cape that have started to look at it as potential pilots. This falls into the category of remediation because the water quality in that estuary has already been degraded, so they're trying to restore it versus remove it before it gets to that water quality or that degraded water body. And this is what's known as a PRB, or permeable reactive barrier. There are different ways of putting that in, but essentially if you looked at this, you consider groundwater flowing through this trench. It could be a 2-foot, 3-foot wide trench, carbon source, sawdust, wood chips, whatever it may be. Or they can dig wells and inject emulsified vegetable oil, again a carbon source, and create a wall of those wells. But essentially as the groundwater flows through, you go through a process known as denitrification, where the nitrogen hits that carbon and goes through that chemical reaction. This is a proven technology for a lot of plumes, meaning concentrated. It's a new technology that hasn't been proven as, at least long-term, for a full water column that has a much lower concentration of nitrogen. So it's difficult to find a location where you can actually do that on a cost-effective basis. We have found a couple, and some communities here on the Cape have started to look at that, but it's not an end-all type solution.
How deep would that have to be, based on some of our water tables, though?
Well, that's the key, is you have to figure out how deep the water table is before you hit the water coming back up into the saltwater surface. So you try to put it closer to the saltwater interface. You're not going to put it in Route 6, which is where your deepest groundwater is. It just would not be cost effective. So typically it's located along the shorelines, or what we had actually recommended back in the original plan was to where you recharge the effluent. We'll talk about that in a minute too. But you take the treated wastewater, you still end up with what's known as an effluent, which still has a little bit of nitrogen left. You put that in the ground. We were recommending putting that where you recharge the effluent, so that you had a concentrated, smaller area. And this is, as many of you may know, you actually do reclaim water or water reuse at your Bayberry Hills golf course. This is just a little bit different form. That's the irrigation source where you actually spray irrigate. This has a leaching field beneath it for 325,000 gallons per day below a driving range. So different ways of looking at it, and they actually have a well that's what I refer to as down gradient, meaning if you recharge, where's the groundwater going to go? Down gradient would be where that groundwater is going. They put a well there and pull that up and use that for their irrigation source. So they're reclaiming some of that water that has low concentrations of nitrogen and use that as the irrigation source for the golf course. A little bit of history of what's been done here in Yarmouth. There was what's known as an environmental notification form filed, which summarized your CWMP, your Comprehensive Wastewater Management Plan. Back in 2010, you actually received a certificate and actually had it approved ultimately in August of 2011. So the town of Yarmouth actually has an approved Comprehensive Wastewater Management Plan. The issue is it only had 2 of the 3 watersheds in that plan, because it was before we actually just got the MEP report for Bass River, which was only 2 years ago. So it addressed the Lewis Bay and the Parkers River watersheds. We projected ahead a little bit as to what was going to be needed in Bass River, but we did not have the full scope of what needed to be done in the Bass River watershed. So the town brought that. Actually, phase 1, and I'll review what phase 1 was designed up to about the 90% level. Town funded the design. But when they went for construction money in September, as you heard earlier, it was not funded. As many of you know, you were probably there. And the town then decided not to go forward with what's known as the Development of Regional Impact at the Cape Cod Commission, which is the county level approval. You had state level approval. And that's in part because they knew the Bass River watershed work was still to come, so they sort of put pencils down for a few years and then have restarted within the last couple of years. This is a figure of the recommended sewer service areas at the time that came out of the 2011 recommended program. This is Route 28 from Dennis to Barnstable line. The different colors recommended were different phases. At that time, for those two watersheds, it was divided into 5 phases. The first phase was this green area, and that's what actually has a sewer system designed for. And the treatment plant was to be located up here at what's known as the Buck Island Road site, where the water department building is located and DPW staff. And then there was a main pumping station located right here, entrance to the former drive-in and next to the Parkers River Bridge. That's a site plan of that pumping station. Parkers River Bridge, Parkers River would be right here. Entrance back to the drive-in was to the side. Just showing, again, where the treatment plant would be located and some of the piping network to get there. Site plan of the treatment plant. Treatment plant would be located in these areas. This is the water department building. And then what's known as infiltration basins were to be located here. Any of you who have been by the Barnstable Hyannis treatment plant, they use infiltration basins. You've probably seen those driving by Bierce's Way. Just an open sand basin, sort of like the cranberry bog without the cranberries in it. That's the way to envision it. Just to expand a little bit, since we've been focusing on nitrogen and wastewater, we did look at the town's wells. This depicts your Aquifer Protection District, which is where your 24 wells that you have are located. Vast majority of the wells have shown minimal to no impact. But you do have 2 or 3 wells here in the Captain's Village area that have been showing a steady increase of nitrogen due to the level of dense development located near those wells, which is where they draw their water from. We did look at the pond health, freshwater ponds, based off of some water quality data that the town had been collecting over the years. And of the 5 ponds that we had some reliable data on, Tom Matthews, Long Pond, Dennis Pond, they were all showing some impacts. Flax Pond was a pretty high quality water because it's pretty well protected, a lot of wooded area around it, versus the others have a fair amount of development around them. Now, this is the cost that had been developed back in 2011, and I just want to put this out there. You know, all the costs are going to have to be updated, redone, look at the program, phasing, everything. That's one of the challenges we'll be working with you folks with. But I just wanted to give you this in terms of a scale and things to think about. One, it's a very expensive program. There's no 2 ways about it. And this is before we brought in the Bass River watershed. So this is still looking at Lewis Bay and Parkers River. But we did break it into 5 phases at that point. And things to keep in mind is, and I think one of the things that handicapped that first phase for construction funding is the town of Yarmouth was faced with building their own treatment plant. So on day 1, you were faced with a very expensive item that you needed to construct that was going to serve you for at least up into phase 3, if not phase 4, where you then have to do an expansion to ultimately get the full capacity. But that's a big nut to have to fund until you start getting all your ratepayers by putting sewers in the ground. So that is something to consider as you're going forward, impacting however the finance plan is that you end up developing. This is one of the models for what we refer to as cost recovery. What does that mean? That means how you're going to pay for the program. So you are looking at a combination of tax rate, betterments, meaning charging people who are actually connected to the system, as well as adding a % increase to the water bill at the time, which is what that alternate was. So just to give you a flavor of what the impact was to those users who were connected, meaning they're inside the sewer area, they're looking at $1,000 a year. People, because part was on the tax rate, they're looking at $500 a year. So if you weren't in the sewer service area, you were roughly in the $500 range. If you were connected to the sewer because you had part betterment as well as the tax impact, you're in the $1,000 range. So where are we today? Again, you have an approved comprehensive wastewater management plan. Still needs to go through the Cape Cod Commission, and they've changed their process now. It's that you don't go through the development of regional impact. They have another program. You evaluate you on 10 different items because they realized development of regional impact was really for a one project site location type of evaluation, versus they realized these programs are town-wide and often facilities that don't exist.
On the Cape Cod Commission, when you're saying that you don't have to go through a development of regional impact, is that based on the new draft of the regional policy plan they put out, or thus the form of the enabling act that they have originally in place now?
They've changed the process. It's
It's a two-way.
It's a consistency plan. It's a consistency review of the 208 plan
So that's
versus
the plan,
development.
that's the one that,
Updated plan.
so that's the one they changed about a year and a half ago?
Yes.
Do you have any information on their new draft plan that's out as of September 20th?
That's the regional policy plan. Yeah, I think actually there's a public hearing in Yarmouth coming up in 2 weeks, I think.
On the 24th.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do have a copy of it, I haven't actually opened it yet, but I was just wondering if you had.
One of the things that is part of that review, they review it for consistency with their regional policy
Right.
plan. So that would still have to be done. Because you have an approved comprehensive wastewater management plan, the next plan that you file, which includes Bass River and whatever modifications the committee develops for that plan, we would file what's known as a notice of project change. We don't have to file a new comprehensive wastewater management plan. It's a update, revisions to what's already been approved. Something we'll talk about in more detail, but a new program that has come up with versus the 2011 version is discussions ongoing now with Yarmouth, Dennis, and Harwich, as well as we've reopened discussions that we had had back in 2010 for the Lewis Bay watershed with Barnstable. So you're now looking at some partnership options, which I think have a lot of benefits to Yarmouth that are being evaluated. And then ultimately, again, as we said, we have to file. MEPR is the Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act, the state, and then the Cape Cod Commission. So the thought would be that those would be filed next year. Back in 2017, town staff was actively involved. That's why I said we started roughly 2 years ago trying to reactivate this process program. Town staff put a lot of time and effort into updating what alternatives are out there and what would be the cost to Yarmouth, because they were getting questions of Do we really need to put pipes in the ground and do a sewer system? Isn't there something else out there that we could do? So, based on that, they went out and they looked at, aquaculture, just doing Title V again, do an innovative alternative, which is a more sophisticated Title V. As I said, it's like a small little treatment plant on your site. Giving everybody incinerator toilets, doing cluster systems. That's the neighborhood type system. You put 30 to 40 people on a treatment plant. Do a satellite plant where you might have 100 to 200 people on it. Or look at the centralized solution that they had previously. When all was said and done, they looked at the cost for the programs, and they looked at yearly maintenance and the percent nitrogen removal. So if you go back and look at the percent nitrogen removal that we needed to do to restore those estuaries to a healthy water quality environment, some of the options on the top sort of fall off. Again, you couldn't put innovative alternative systems on every lot and meet your water quality requirements. So the recommendation, based on 2017 update, was to stay with the proposed recommended municipal system.
I find that interesting that your installation cost between an IA and a centralized treatment is only $3 million, and yet you get more benefit out of centralized treatment, and your maintenance costs are less than the IA system, than the IA model, I should say. If you look at both columns, it shows you right there why IAs won't work, which has been an argument for many years in this whole process.
Right, right. And we've done brochures. We also do the wastewater planning in Dennis and Harwich. And we've done some brochures for those based off a letter that the Department of Environmental Protection wrote. And it shows that it's 3 times more costly to the residential homeowner to do a IA system than it is to connect into a municipal system.
Is it still the case that the uneven flow of a single household makes it harder for those to work properly?
That is
one of
the
the
issue.
arguments
If
originally.
you're not getting a steady flow to these treatment systems, there's not like a light switch. You can't go turn them off and on. You have to have a steady flow going to them in order to keep the treatment level up at its highest performance level. And that is very difficult to do if you're not giving it that steady day-to-day dosage of food on a year-round basis. So somebody who has a second home down here or comes down weekends or whatever, they're not giving it that steady flow, so it's just not going to work even at the high level. And at the highest performance level, which you saw from a few slides ago, that doesn't even get us the percent removal that we need. Good question. So, as part of that 2017 work too with the town, we looked at what type of phasing could we do, and we evaluated the Bass River estuaries report to figure out how much nitrogen needed to be removed there. You saw earlier that 60% number. So we're now into having to collect nitrogen from homes up north of Route 6, as well as pretty much everything south of Route 6 in the watershed. And so we're now looking, and we had done a first pass at an 8-phase program. 8 phases, roughly over 40 years, 1 phase every 5 years. And that's to spread it just to make it somewhat feasible from a cost perspective. And the town was looking to try and do a phase 1 of not only on the western side to Parkers River, but to bring phase 1 all the way on Route 28 over to the Dennis line, to try and pick up the larger flow areas as well as help the commercial economic development. The town also had us hire the Donahue Institute out of UMass Boston. They had done a economic study for the town of Dennis, and so Yarmouth wanted to piggyback off of that and do an even more detailed study. I think copies of that study have either been emailed out to you or there's some hard copies here tonight. I encourage you to read that and get comments back to the town, Rich or Jeff, because they are looking to try to get comments back to the Donahue Institute so that they can finalize that. But I think a couple of takeaways from that study are that, in general, businesses do not want to be in the wastewater business. They want to do the business that they're in, whether it's a hotel, motel, restaurant. That's the focus they want to be. They don't want to take up a third of their land to have a treatment plant and effluent recharge disposal and everything that goes with that, permitting requirements, hiring an operator, all those things. And that's what happens right now in town. So they interviewed several owners here in town who own restaurants, hotels, and they all came back and said they felt constrained in their economic opportunities because of the wastewater issue. That was pretty universal from everyone they spoke to. And one of the other items that I pulled out, because I found that very interesting, is that for every dollar, and you know, they're looking at several communities who have done these investments. Obviously, you can't look at Yarmouth because you're not there yet. But from the communities that they've been able to evaluate, for every dollar spent on wastewater infrastructure, they're seeing $15 in return from people making investments to improve their properties, additional tourism, use of those facilities coming down, jobs, everything. All that economic return is about 15 to 1. So something to keep in mind when you make that investment and try to justify the cost of this very expensive program. You heard me say earlier partnerships. You also heard me say earlier that we do the work in Dennis and Harwich. So they're expensive in all three towns. Yarmouth, you're not alone, unfortunately. So we've been challenged by all three towns, the committees we deal with and the other communities, the town administrators, selectmen, you name it. What can we do to help lower the cost for a given community? So we floated the idea of, instead of building an individual treatment plant in Yarmouth, individual treatment plant in Dennis, individual treatment plant in Harwich, you build one centralized plant. Unfortunately, all those individual plants are only going to be 3 to 5 miles apart. That's not that great a distance if you were off Cape. Sort of a mentality issue. So we floated the idea. We've had several meetings. We actually applied for a grant. We were able to get a state grant to help fund doing further evaluation, holding some of these discussions. And so the Dennis, Harwich, Yarmouth, for short DHY, Clean Waters Community Partnership has been under evaluation now for a little over a year. Each community has put together a subgroup. We've been meeting with that subgroup on a monthly basis. There is a meeting coming up where we help establish a similar organization for Mansfield, Foxborough, and Norton off Cape, the MFN Regional Wastewater District. 3 communities that did not talk to one another when we started that process. Happy to say that district was formed in 2014. They undertook a $30 million upgrade and expansion to an existing plant that had been owned by the town of Mansfield originally. And it's been working very well. They all get along very well since 2014, so they're actually coming down to talk to selectmen, finance committee, and wastewater committees from the 3 towns during that workshop on the 25th. So I hope you can all attend that meeting to hear from that. It'll be taped if you can't, so that the question and answer session will be available. But to give you some sense of what this means, Dennis is about a little under 2 million gallons of wastewater need. Harwich is a little under 1. And Yarmouth, depending on how much you may or may not send to Barnstable, you're in the 2.7 to 3 million gallon range. So what does that mean in terms of percentage of a centralized treatment plant, which would be located in Dennis, where their DPW facility is off of Theophilus Smith Road? Ends up being more or less the centroid for the 3 towns. So wastewater would be conveyed, and then the treated effluent would be sent back to all 3 towns over time. This just shows you that, you know, these are the different percentages of ownership in that plant based on a flow proportion. What would it take to do a DHY, Clean Waters Community Partnership? Well, town meeting in each of the 3 towns this past spring passed a town meeting article allowing the boards of selectmen to consider filing special legislation with the state legislature to adopt rules, regulations, state law to create that partnership, only to allow the creation of the partnership. They have all approved that language now, and that legislation was filed a little over a week ago. So the hope is where it mirrors, essentially mimics the MFN special legislation, that it will be able to be passed this fall, even though the legislature is out of session. Presumably none of the other legislators would object to the creation of that. I would add that that MFN district, that was the first district created in Massachusetts in well over 20 years for that, so it shows that working together is actually coming back in vogue. There were several districts formed back in the 70s, early 80s, when the federal government and state were paying 90% of the ticket. Those days are long gone. Now we can try to apply for 0% interest loans if it's nutrient related, or just the state revolving fund loan program, which is around 2% interest. Better than municipalities can do on their own, which is in the 3.5% to 4% range. So there is something out there to help save money, and that's what we're trying to do, and doing things on a regional or partnership basis, because those loan programs are competitive, helps put you at the top of the list, or move you towards the top of the list. And proof of that is Harwich right now, the East Harwich area. They have an intermunicipal agreement to send the flow from that area collected to the Chatham treatment plant. They bought capacity in that plant. They have that agreement with them. And so when we filed the SRF loan application for that, it's actually the highest rated one in the state right now, in part because they get so many more points for doing it on a regional basis. So this is where we are. The goal is to try to, now that the legislation's been filed, to develop an agreement, which is where all the details are, that the towns can agree to. That agreement would have to come back to the boards of selectmen, who would have to endorse it to then put an article on town meeting. The thought is potentially town meeting next spring. And so each community has to endorse at town meeting that they want to be part of that partnership. So it's not your board of selectmen sitting here saying, we're going to do this. It's the residents of each community who would have to say that they want to move forward in being part of that partnership. But I would tell you that you all have to do your own collection systems, every town. Your cost savings is in the treatment plants. And that's the biggest, I saw in the table earlier, that big piece that Yarmouth tried to fund back in 2011. Well, if you can share that amongst 3 communities, that's where you could save money from a capital perspective, but more importantly, even on an operation and maintenance on an annual basis perspective. Just even trying to find operators today is very difficult. let alone bring operators to Cape Cod for year-round. You have a question?
Who's charged with drafting the agreement?
The subgroups that have been formed by the 3 towns that we're meeting with on that monthly basis. So that draft, we'll be having a community meeting, I think in November was the
November,
target.
December,
Mhm.
once the subgroups draft that agreement.
Are they working on one draft, or is each subgroup working on their own?
No, we're with the monthly meetings, we discuss the current draft, and they'll be coming out with a recommended program from that. So what we did to try to help facilitate that was we took the recommended plan as it stands today. You know, again, Yarmouth is up for discussion. We're here to take guidance from you folks as to how this may look. Dennis has developed theirs and Harwich has developed theirs. They have an approved comprehensive wastewater management plan. Dennis has filed a draft, and we're getting ready to file, address the comments from the draft and file a final within the next few months. Each of them have their own solutions, but they also both very interested in working with Yarmouth on that clean water partnership. So they're looking at their own solution and comparing it to sort of the regional or partnership option. Similar probably with Yarmouth. I mean, you still have a acceptable treatment plant site. You're also having discussions over here with Barnstable. So a lot of work to be done, a lot of potential, but also a lot of potential with that Clean Waters partnership with Dennis and Harwich. The other thing that we've done, and Jeff Colby has been instrumental in helping us with this, Tom Andrade and Dennis. We had a meeting with the Mass Department of Transportation folks. I think there's a meeting going on in Town Hall tonight regarding one of these projects.
With me.
But we sat down and we started to list all the projects that they have lined up or have just started, from Barnstable to Harwich. The person had them all, their project manager had them all in their head. And we're taking notes and putting this all together. And so we said, wait a minute, we got to put this all down in a figure to show what's going to be happening from over here in Barnstable all the way over to Harwich, and put down what the timeline is, what the work is, because as you saw, each community is looking to put pipes in the ground, particularly along Route 28. And the way the process works is once they build something, you're blocked from putting anything else in that street for at least a 5-year period. The other side of the coin is if you can line up and do your design and know what you want to put in and give them that pipe and elevation and everything, they'll put it in as part of their project because they're doing their project. So all you have to do is pay for putting the pipe in. They're going to do the sidewalks, they're going to do the paving, they're going to do everything else, instead of you having to do it afterwards. So any place that we can line up over here and make sure that we're in tune, a good example is the one that's being public hearing tonight, North Main Street. Another good example is the Bass River Bridge. If we can give them the pipe sleeves and sizes that they want to put in that bridge, you know, when they go to start construction in a little over a year, fall 2020, you've already got your pipes in there. And it's doing it at a much more cost-effective basis. So again, we're trying to look at ways that we can save communities money, and if we can dovetail and stay ahead of the curve, particularly on a lot of these projects, it's another way for you to save money. And they're going ahead with these projects no matter what. So if you can get in line and dovetail that's a plus. So where are we? What are the next steps? Mr. Chairman, this is open to you, but our thought is you need to be reviewing and become familiar with the areas that we have put forth for sewering, and then address, you know, do we have the right phasing plan? We've done what we think is legitimate based off prior work, but that's all open to discussion. You need to review the planning and economic areas. You've done a couple economic districts from a couple programs that have come out. You need to get that input, and that may impact your phasing because you want to take advantage of that economic benefit and revitalization of some of the areas, in particularly Route 28 or South Shore. As part of that, we'll be able to adjust the cost and give you the cost by phases. But then you need to work to develop the cost recovery program. And that may be your most difficult task. You heard earlier, part of the reason it wasn't funded back in 2011 is people hadn't bought into, one, the issue, but two, the cost recovery program that was put on the table at that time. It's an expensive program, but I think a lot of people, we've worked with Harwich and Dennis to develop their programs, and when people have seen the results, the projection of $150 to $400 per year if it's put 100% on the tax rate for everybody in town, the reaction has been, really? You sure you're not by a couple of zeros? I thought that was going to be tens of thousands of dollars impacting me on an annual basis. So, things to consider. The town needs to look at those options. You're going to need to get buy-in from the different groups. And that's where you folks are all going to come in, working with town staff to help develop that. And we'll be working with you to help develop the cost updates. Do you have a question, Tom?
No, I was just going to follow up in regards to the original cost. I believe that there were no alternatives. We just put on the real estate tax. Pure and simple.
And
I think that was part of the pushback.
one other point to add is that I believe was only a 20 or 30-year payback, whereas now DEP has allowed the extension to 40 years, which reduces the annual cost.
We need to keep having the discussions with the partnerships. I think that's in your best interest. Barnstable, looking at Lewis Bay flow going there. We're looking at 3 or 4 options as to how to do that, what the costs are. We're in the process of generating those costs now. As well as looking at you sending the rest of your flow to Dennis for the Dennis Harwich Yarmouth solution, or sending all your flow there. Those are the 2 options we're looking at as part of that DHY discussion. Did you have a question?
If you're working with Barnstable for an agreement there, a municipal agreement, if that fails, we'll be flexible enough to still, with all this legislation and everything, be able to send everything to Dennis.
Yes, we're looking at as part of the DHY partnership, we're looking at 2 options. 1, all of Yarmouth, and 2, all of Yarmouth minus what would go to Barnstable. That's why on that table I had before, there was a flow range of 2.7 to 3 million gallons for Yarmouth.
David, once the 3 towns sign the collective agreements, then they'll operate as one body. So I think that what I see is an ongoing change, continuous change of the plans when you look at the reflection of so many years. So when we look at those plans and realize that we may have to make amendments to those plans because of conditions or what have you, they would act as one body.
Let me further explain the DHY. That's a good question. The way it's envisioned now, and the way the template that we're using, which is the MFN wastewater district, is the partnership would only deal with the treatment and the effluent recharge, and they would be a separate entity. So it would be run and overseen by commissioners appointed by the 3 towns, but you would still control all the options that may change, the phasing, all that of your own local system, which is over 70% of the cost of your program. So, one of the questions we keep being asked is, well, if they're a separate entity, do the taxpayers, ratepayers, residents of Yarmouth ever get a say in that again? Well, if they're going to get a say because they have to vote to do their own collection system and on, and they also elect the Board of Selectmen, who are the ones who appoint the commissioners to oversee the partnership. So there's a lot of public input still that would go on, but yeah, to be clear, and I probably glossed over that, the partnership would only do treatment and effluent recharge. The local systems, how you implement that, phase it, what type of system you put in, whether it's gravity, vacuum, pressure, whatever it may be, is all still local within the 3 towns. Once we solve those top 5 bullets real easy, then we'll follow that notice of project change that I indicated and go through the state and county process, and that would be envisioned to be sometime next year. This is an economic study that the Cape Cod Commission had done as part of their 208 plan. And the reason I like to put this in is that, you know, it does show, as we showed graphically back at the, I think the 2nd or 3rd slide, but they put some numbers to it, and they showed that a 1% decrease in water quality results in about a 0.6 or % decrease in the value of someone's home. And often that, you know, the towns collect the same amount of taxes, whether the valuation along a water body is degrading or not. So all that does is shift the burden more to those who can least afford it, shifts it inland. But this, they did show, have some numbers and back up, and it shows that as the water quality gets worse, you are going to see an economic impact to everyone. It's not just those living on those degraded water quality plots. So I know I've covered a lot. I know I glossed over probably a couple things, and I'm sure you all have burning questions on your mind, and I'd be happy to try to answer any of them. Tom, what did I forget?
I don't know, I was curious about the Conservation Law Foundation. Status,
Yeah.
Time frame.
time,
Well, there's 2 things. One, regarding what really started this, they were the ones who triggered getting the 208 plan done, and that's why the EPA stepped in, charged the Cape Cod Commission with updating that 208 plan. They got the funds, and what that was is they put their lawsuit sort of on the shelf. There was never a decision made. It was just put on the shelf as long as they were willing to do that updated plan. And as part of that plan, it required each of the 15 communities here in Barnstable County to submit their program for what they're planning to do. Yarmouth did that. They had to designate who was in charge of overseeing that plan. And I think just about every community on the Cape designated their Board of Selectmen acting as sewer commissioners under Mass General Law. So Yarmouth has submitted that plan, which essentially mirrored the comprehensive wastewater management plan that you had done earlier, and I think we included the 8-phase plan to update the Bass River since that MEP was out. So that's where you stand, and you're supposed to submit annually now, every, I think in May, June, to the commission, an update of where you are in terms of implementing the plan that you've submitted. So as long as communities keep doing that, theoretically, they'll stay at arm's length.
it's the.
The reason I say theoretically, I'll get to you in a minute, theoretically is they have just sued 2 resorts in the town of Harwich, who have been doing everything they can. They both have packaged treatment plants. They both meet their groundwater discharge permits that have been issued by the Mass Department of Environmental Protection. They recharge to the ground, that then flows out into an estuary. Conservation Law Foundation is trying to use the federal permitting requirements versus the local state permitting requirements to say that they need a more stringent permit, known as an NPDS permit, which would then give them more control over the timeline for updating the efforts of those two resorts. So how long they're going to sit on the sidelines, I don't know. You also get a freedom of information request for something.
Yeah, I mean, just to speak very, we can be careful on how we cage this, but I think that it's a real threat with regards to the Conservation Law Foundation has definitely expressed an interest in continuing to sue entities they don't feel are working fast enough. And in my direct discussions with them at Open Cape and other places, they've specifically cited Yarmouth as not moving quick enough. So I think the potential for lawsuits is very real. They've also cited Barnstable and others that they feel aren't moving as quick as possible as well. When I've sat and talked with different representatives of the Conservation Law Foundation, talked about all the great work that we're doing and working with other neighboring communities and moving our wastewater planning efforts forward. The question after I've done explaining all that they say, and it's the only one that they care about, is do you have any pipes in the ground? How quickly are you putting pipes in the ground? That's what they want to know. And so they just want towns to work more quickly. I do think that that's their motive.
Yeah, I'd like to comment on that as well. I had a meeting with Chris Killian from CLF a couple months ago, and he was asked specifically what their plans are for the rest of the Cape Towns. The news had just come out about what they were doing in Harwich and at the Wequassett, and they're definitely looking at Yarmouth. They were very openly critical of the lack of progress in Yarmouth, and I think what they're going to do is, now they've identified a legal approach already, but it wouldn't surprise me if they explore other legal approaches as well. But I do think we're on their short list of communities to target. I'm a believer that the CLF will push DEP into designating these nitrogen-sensitive areas and then forcing communities to upgrade septic systems in those areas. It's sort of using, as Kurt had mentioned, a more expensive overall approach in terms of addressing the problem. So the watersheds have been delineated in Yarmouth. They've been delineated all across the Cape. So if you look at the watersheds that are directly impacting Bass River and Lewis Bay, the areas that are of critical concern, I think what they're going to be doing is if you're in that watershed, within that watershed, let's say feeding Lewis Bay or Bass River, it may be the entire watershed or maybe a large portion of it. They'll designate it as a nitrogen-sensitive area and force people to upgrade systems in that area. Now, when you add up the cost of addressing a problem through forcing individuals to take action, the amount of money that individuals will be forced to pay is significant, it's huge. And so that's the issue that we have to wrestle with in Yarmouth. One of the things that I'd like to see is in the discussions with the neighboring towns, I'd like to see an approach that other communities have taken, and that is we should have an agreement with Barnstable on how to deal with the nitrogen problems in Lewis Bay. Because I think this is part of the problem that we had at town meeting in 2011, is this whole perception that we're doing it all alone. So I think the Yarmouth voters will be inclined or receptive to invest in facilities if they know that as we address the problems in Lewis Bay, we're not doing it by ourselves, but we're doing it in tandem with our neighboring town of Barnstable. Because we can't solve the problems in Lewis Bay by ourselves. We need them on board. And I know there have been some discussions going on. I've had my own discussions with councilors, but those need to accelerate. The same with Bass River. It's great that we're talking to Dennis, but the two towns basically have to come together and have a deal that says that we're both committed to solve that problem there. Because those are the things that people are going to come after us on. Is CLF is going to sue us about Bass River and meeting the targets there as well as in Lewis Bay. So at some point, we need to accelerate some of these discussions with the town so that we can come to some agreement in protecting those watersheds.
Well, I think it's key that some kind of agreement gets made with Barnstable on your level so that we can do our job, because we need to say to Dave and his company, all right, that pipe's going that way, and the rest of the pipe's going that way, or the whole pipe is going that way.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I think sooner rather than later, we need to be able to answer those questions.
I agree completely. But I do think that while CLF, this is just my own guess, CLF has not told me that that's the approach that they're going to take. But you can almost see the handwriting on the wall. I mean, DEP is already in their letter to Yarmouth and the other towns said if the towns don't take their own steps at a municipal level or in tandem with other towns, we're prepared to explore this path. And I do think that's a letter that should be shared with this group. I think you should be very familiar with it. I know that in my discussions with the coffee shop and with my friends and with others who still have their heads in the sand on this, I've told them, listen, if you don't want to come to town meeting and help us solve a problem, the other option is yeah, we could do nothing, but guess what? That problem is now on your lap, all right? If you live in a nitrogen-sensitive area, guess what? You may be stuck with the cost of spending 30, 40 grand, plus the thousands of dollars every year, and having to monitor an alternative system, because that, at some point, is what you may be faced with. And if you make the comparisons between what you could do through a town-sponsored initiative, it's significantly less money. But there is this notion out there that we can continue to keep our heads in the sand on this, and sort of somehow the problem goes away. Actually, if we don't do anything, the problem can get, actually, for the homeowner, much worse. That's the point I've been getting across. And I think that's a point that sunk in Harwich, when they went to town meeting recently, or last year, that was a point that people actually paid attention to. And with the folks there, they got that point across. So I think that's something that we need to be a little bit more versed on.
Yes, we will send you the letter that the Mass Department of Environmental Protection wrote to Harwich, which discussed if the towns don't move forward, they are going to change the regulations and require, they would designate as an example, everybody within the Parker River watershed, not the areas we've defined as needing to be collected and sewered, but everybody to be in that nitrogen-sensitive area and to have to put in an innovative alternative system. And that's where we indicated it's 3 times more costly for that person to do that. So we generated a brochure that showed if you're connected to the sewer, if you're not connected to the sewer, or if you have to put in your own innovative alternative system. We will send that brochure out to you too, that was generated for Harwich, because the cost will be very similar here in Yarmouth. And that was the eye-opener when people saw that cost.
Excuse me, Mark, just to,
Yes.
it sounds like the Conservation Law Foundation is not only setting the requirements, but it's also setting the time frame.
Well, what happens is if you find yourself, let's say there's a court action or some litigation, they'll be suing probably somebody else. And what I'm concerned about is they could sue DEP to implement sections of the 208 plan, identify the most impacted watersheds and estuaries, and then what happens is the schedule and timing is based on the most critical areas that need to be addressed. Since we're the furthest behind, we're probably going to be at the front of the pack, being forced, and again, it doesn't take rocket science, because all the watersheds have been delineated under the 208 program. They've looked at all the different technologies. It's sort of like basically all the pieces of it. All they have to do is put a few of them together. And what's to prevent CLF from saying, okay, you haven't made progress on 208, you're dragging your feet, pipes down in the ground, so guess what? DEP, we're going to force you to take action under your authority to update your requirements and go forward with implementing this proposal to designate these nitrogen-sensitive areas. And guess what? We're way behind the 8 ball. We're playing catch-up.
And to that point, it might be on their schedule, not our schedule.
Exactly.
We want it to be on Yarmouth's
Good time
schedule.
frame, yeah.
Right.
But I think the thing that we can focus on is what we're doing now. I don't think we can control what CLF does. So if we're focused on moving it forward, the more we do, the more we can go to them and say we are working on it. Case being, working with the DYH, or the DHY towns, and saying we are moving forward with corroborating with these other towns and getting this done. So, you know, that's all, I mean, that's all we can do. We
Right.
can just focus on what we're doing. I don't think.
And
that we
I
can-
think if you show that you are continuing to make
Yeah.
progress, that it's tough for them to push back. Not to say they won't, but.
Yes, see, I have a feeling they're gonna be aggressive in court, and the thing is I also believe that when you talk about litigation, it actually provokes the wrong reaction among residents. It's, at least the people that I talk to, they say, well, go ahead, let them sue, you know, big deal.
That was the attitude.
It is,
Right,
it's a strong
That was the
strong on tactic that they're gonna push back.
Well, here's the other reason you don't want to go there. So the money you should be putting into dealing with this problem, you're spending on litigation.
Right. They could actually help us one of them.
Tom?
Yeah, does the state still offer the 0% or 1% loan to communities? I know the first time around, there was talk about trying to get on a list.
Yep.
There was a short list available.
Yes, as part of the state revolving fund SRF loan program, they have to designate 33% of that towards zero interest loans. Now, to qualify, the project has to be nutrient related, meaning removing nitrogen. You have to have an approved comprehensive wastewater management plan, which is what you're in the process of updating. You can't be under an administrative order or a lawsuit. So keep moving. And you have to be consistent with the regional policy plan. And then you have to have what's known as land use controls in place. So when we say that, based on your flow, that you're looking at roughly 3 million gallons in that sewer service area that we're showing in those phases, you need to manage to that 3 million gallon number. So you need to put enough flow in there if you want to do economic development. And as you may recall, we had some discussions about the village center areas back in 2011. So we put a little bit extra flow for, I think, 3 of the village centers at the time. You know, we need to revisit that to make sure that that's.
About 400,000 gallons at that point. But I read in the information that was passed out that with the system that we're looking at, we're going to have the ability to create our sewer needs now. And then we're going to have a surplus of 21%.
That's what's known as build-out, I think.
Okay.
Now, the reason what build-out is, question, is we're looking at existing flows,
Right.
and then there's a flow that we plan to, which is known as build-out. Now,
Right.
what is build-out between existing and that? That means what could be built within your current zoning. Doesn't mean it's going to be built in 5 years, doesn't mean it's going to be built in 20. It's what could be built under your current zoning. We've added the flow in for that. And then in some instances, we added a little more flow should you change your zoning in those village centers to
See,
accommodate that.
That's the point. The planning board over the past several years have created tremendous opportunities for business owners and developers alike, anticipating the big pipe system coming through. So a lot of these folks are just waiting for the sewer so they can expand.
Case in point, when Dennis got their economic development study, they upped their flow by another 250,000 gallons for the whole Route 134 or 28 corridor to allow for that, even though it's not under current zoning, so that they can put that in the flow. We can develop the land use control documents that say you're going to manage to that flow per this plan. You're not going to get an approved plan and then suddenly say, oh, I need another 500,000 gallons because so-and-so development's coming in. The state will not give you the money for that. They will not give you a zero interest loan unless you have those regulations in place. So those are the 5 criteria in order to qualify for zero interest loans. The good news is, if you do it on a regional partnership basis, again, you get a lot more points than someone doing it on their own.
I would think so. That makes sense.
That's what they encourage.
Yeah.
Can you give us an update as to what's going on between Yarmouth and Barnstable right now? Where are we?
Well, we've had some discussions with their staff, their DPW, wastewater folks. We've identified 2 or 3 options for how to get the wastewater over there and then bring more effluent back. The issue is you're looking for wastewater capacity to treat that's closer to another treatment plant than conveying over to Dennis. That's how you minimize your cost in that conveyance. The difficulty is it's only a half-mile difference. One's 4.5 miles and one's 5 miles. But we're running the numbers for that. The issue with Barnstable is they need effluent recharge capacity. So, and I'll just throw this number out, if you bring 300,000 gallons of wastewater over to Barnstable, they would want you to bring 1 million gallons of effluent back and recharge it at your Buck Island Road site here. So we would need to factor in that additional nitrogen and what have you there. But you don't need this effluent recharge site if you do the DHY partnership. One of the items that we're looking at is the Bass River Golf Course, and looking at putting a lot of effluent in at that site. It has a lot of potential based on some preliminary groundwater modeling we've been doing and some field work. Would require you to essentially rebuild the golf course, but that has tremendous potential too. And a lot of options for the town to look at there. But if you did that, between using that site, sites identified in Dennis and sites identified in Harwich, we have enough effluent recharge capacity without you using this site. So that's suddenly become an asset to the town of Yarmouth. So if you're willing to take more effluent back from Barnstable and recharge it there, which helps increase your groundwater flow and flushing in through here, because all that flow comes down through here. It's not going that way, it's not going north, it's coming right down through here. That's a way for you to help offset some costs. So we're in the process of crunching those numbers, and then we'll be getting back to have discussions with the Barnstable folks.
I guess the problem with Barnstable is that if we've got something that we can trade with them on, but they may end up dragging their feet. The question is, you know, are we going to be designing a system that's going to take, you know, take the entire flow over to Dennis? Or we've also got to wait for some legislation to get through the legislature to have an agreement with Barnstable? Is that's true? So they're going to be...
No, the legislation is just regarding the DHY partnership. If
Right.
if you went to Barnstable, you would do a intermunicipal agreement, which the two parties can do.
Oh, you can
You don't
do
need
that.
state input on that.
Well, that's what
Okay.
Harwich is doing in East Harwich with
Yeah.
Chatham. That's not special
Because
legislation.
it's just 2 communities versus the 3.
Okay.
And you're not creating a separate entity, you're just buying capacity, having an agreement to go to their existing facility.
But you also have to recognize that we both have to be on the same page with how we're going to work on Lewis Bay.
Right.
Right, so what I don't know is what are they doing on their side of the town?
There should be 2 conversations at the same
Right,
time.
right, and we need to make sure that, because otherwise, if we're doing this by ourselves, it's gonna be difficult to convince people to make an investment in just cleaning up half a portion of Lewis Bay.
Yeah, no,
So
the
there needs to be a discussion at multiple levels.
The
to
vast
make sure that
majority
we're
of
on the
this
hook. What's
is
that?
already sewered in Barnstable. That's
All
the
of that
area.
area is?
Pretty much.
The vast majority. They're looking to sewer this area right here
Yeah.
that they have, but most of this area is already
I thought that area around the hospital, there were areas around the hospital that needed to be.
very, very small areas, and they're looking to infill that, but the vast majority is already sewered. The areas that they're looking to sewer is outside of that, and so for them to bring that flow into their treatment plant site, and then where do they recharge is where they're having trouble.
So you would think that from a regulatory point of view, since that we're both on the hook for cleaning up Lewis Bay, that there'd be also some incentive for them. Or could they make the argument to regulators that they're doing everything that they can, or most of what can be done on their part?
And Yarmouth is lagging behind.
What's that?
And Yarmouth would be lagging
We're
behind.
the laggards on this then.
I thought the conversation years ago was that Barnstable had the treatment capacity, they just didn't have the disposal capacity.
That's
Exactly.
Yeah.
exactly it.
So, yeah, I think that, it sounds like if we can give them a place to get rid of it, they can expand their sewers,
Right.
take in ours, and everybody's happy.
John?
I noticed that the north side, Yarmouth, Dennis, and even the north Harwich don't seem to be included in any of the phases.
Good question. Let me point to this. The watersheds that are up here, they all flow to the north. So, and same with Brewster, most of their watersheds there, they have a little bit that flows out to Pleasant Bay. But all these watersheds flow to Cape Cod Bay, which has tremendous flushing, or there's a huge marshland system in this Chase Garden Creek that flows over to Barnesville Harbor, which actually takes up nitrogen. So this is what we refer to as a nitrogen sink, meaning you can actually add more nitrogen there. So the water quality, and you don't have the estuaries, is impacted up here. We're still waiting in Dennis for the MEP study on Seward Harbor. But they're dredging that back out to existing conditions. They've increased the flushing here when they redid the culvert at Bridge Street. So the thought is that if there is something up there, it would be minimal. But all the others, the estuaries, tend to be on the south side.
So there'll never be a sewer plan for the north side?
Not currently, no.
But
Good
for
question.
nitrogen purposes.
Yes.
The community, 40 years from now,
Yeah.
when you're done with the rest of it, could decide to sewer the whole town. Chatham is facing this right now. They have a plan that's a 20-year plan to sewer 2/3 of the town, but they finally come to the realization they're far enough along their plan that they're just going to do the whole town.
And similarly, Scargo Lake in Dennis, that's still to be decided, but they may do a sewer service area around that just because it's being impacted by phosphorus, even though it does have a little bit of a tidal influx at high tides, super high tides. So there may be other reasons for that, but it's not necessarily nitrogen related. Good question.
So you commented on the quality of Tom Matthews Pond, though, which is right off of 6A on the north side.
So we need to look at ultimately what a potential solution.
Is that more about the flow in, the flow out, more than anything, would you say?
Well, most of those ponds are what's known as kettle ponds, meaning it's just a reflection of the groundwater table. It's a bowl.
Yeah.
You don't have inlets and outlets.
Actually, Tom Matthews is a man-made pond, as I understand. They built a dike at would be the northern end of it, and created the pond way back before anybody cared about those things, I guess.
Yep. Yep.
David, how about Run Pond, up there off of Shore Road or South Shore Road?
South Shore Drive, right?
Smuggler's Beach.
Beach.
That seems to be
It's over here.
getting
right?
smaller and smaller and smaller, all
Yeah.
kinds of.
Weren't you doing isn't that where you were doing some stormwater or going to do a culvert?
Yeah, well, I really like the way Dave did the presentation where he talks about stormwater and other things that we're looking at. You know, it's not just wastewater, although that's a big part of that pie that you saw up there.
Yeah.
So we're looking at some stormwater opportunities, actually working with Selectman Forrest with regards to some Army Corps funding for potential to increase some flushing
Good.
there. That was a project that, well before my time, but Carl Von Hohen was involved in.
I remember that.
For doing some work there as well. So there is some overlap with all of these projects that we're
Okay.
looking to other solutions or other pieces of the pie, if you will, that might help improve some of those areas.
Some of the people that I'll be talking to up in that area are very concerned about that. That's why I'm
Sure.
If I can just add, I met with some of your folks at office hours at the library the other day. I asked the Corps of Engineers years ago, when I worked for Congressman Studs, to find areas along the coast of the Cape to exercise or utilize an authority that they have, that they haven't really done much with, and that is to restore or improve coastal ecosystems. And they do have this authority. We wanted to find out if they could exercise that authority in some communities along the south side, and then identify a list of projects and then help get them money for those projects. That's an authority that exists that could potentially be utilized in other projects that we may want to tee up here in Yarmouth. The Run Pond project has just gotten an updated cost estimate. They're prepared to come here and meet with Carl and the Civic Association, and anybody else for that matter, to update people on what those cost estimates are and what the potential cost sharing is. I think the initial deal was like a 60-40, 65, 35 arrangement. Those percentages may have changed, so they can update us on that. But you'd be amazed at the variety of programs that exist for doing some of these coastal restoration initiatives. As some of you know, I chair the Cape Cod Conservation District, and last year we brought $11 million in federal funds to implement a Cape-wide master plan for coastal restoration. And Yarmouth's getting a pretty good chunk of money. We've got money going into the Baxter Gristmill,
And Parker's River.
Parker's River, and we've looked at some other projects. We'll probably get another infusion of money
I think the
Next year.
issue is the size of that pipe
in the cost.
that flows into
The cost, I think we went to town meeting on that project several years ago, and I think people were skittish about the magnitude of the cost. I don't think it lost by much.
No, it's really closing in now.
Yeah, I
We're
was,
starting to smell
The
it.
cost has gotten much worse. We just started talking about a capital budget
oh
this
yeah.
afternoon. The
Did
number-
Carl give you the update on from the Corps?
Yeah,
So,
I think it's a $9 million number now.
yeah,
Oh,
it's gone from like 3 million or 4
Yeah.
million to, yeah, so maybe we can get more money out of the Army Corps to make it easy for us to see.
You know, because I wear several hats and think big picture, I think, you know, in our conversation with Carl, one problem is we're on pond, the other problem is the dredging issues that are creating some of these nitrogen problems. And, you know, do we look at it at this committee level as part of the funding, that maybe we fund some of that, like Dave said about denitrification, if that can help, then maybe it can come under this purview with the SRF funds.
I think you should look big picture myself.
Yeah, and we just had a meeting with Barnstable, and for example, they have a program where they use excise tax revenue, local option excise tax revenues, room tax, meals tax, to fund a separate fund that they're dedicating. And the big discussion is how that fund has evolved over the years from a pure wastewater funding initiative to now roads are included, and now they're exploring dredging being included, because it all comes back to this overall improvement of nitrogen flushing. And Jeff and Dave are both well aware of, for example, the discussions that have been happening with Bass River on the bike bridge and the eventual Route 6 bridge, of how that might impact the flushing of Bass River and improve and reduce the amount of removal we need to do in the Bass River watershed because of that. So it is all related, and I think people are starting to come around, and you're starting to see the funding sources having projects like dredging be eligible project costs for reimbursement.
I think things like, when we get into, I think in my mind right now, phase one's probably gonna be the same as it always has been, it's just a matter of which way does it flow. But when we get into the neighborhoods, and you work with Jeff's road program, you know, which neighborhood needs to have this road reworked the worst? Maybe that's, you know, otherwise things being equal, you say, all right, these roads are in worse condition, so let's get in there, we'll do the sewers, and then we can rebuild those roads and get them done. You know, so we're maximizing the life of the roadways we have to minimize the cost there too. And I think even going forward, because I heard about this Route 28 project a few weeks ago, you know, I got thinking about, how about water mains? Not that it's our problem, but as a town, think about water main upgrade before this gets done. You know, what's National Grid doing? Do they need to do anything? So that once this road gets, especially Route 28 gets rebuilt, everybody should be happy that they've done what they could do beforehand. So I think, again, another big picture thing where I think everybody has to communicate about what's going to be happening.
Well, it looks like with Mass DOT, there are a lot of projects that are basically coming at us relatively soon.
Absolutely.
So I think
Yeah,
it
some
may
are about
very
2
well
years
be-
and some are 3, 4,
Exactly,
5
yes.
years.
So I think we're gonna have to really zero in on some of those projects relatively quickly.
I'm not sure what you're referring to, Mr. Chairman, but I believe you're talking about phase one of the Route 28, kind of the coast-to-coast phase.
Yes.
And so to that point, you know, there's a lot of coordination if Mass DOT and Jeff has the details on the utility work that can be done, but you know, if we have a commitment or a project phase that's aimed at completing all Route 28, makes that project coordination with what's going to happen on 28 a whole lot easier than if you're picking pieces parts of it over a number of years.
Well, like everything else, we talk, as you know, we keep talking about all these capital projects and the inflation rate in some of them too, that for every year we wait, the worse it gets. You know, we're in the middle of the DPW garage, which is exponentially more expensive than was originally proposed. You know, we're in a school project that's very expensive, sewer projects are very expensive, you know, any of this stuff. So every year, it's different numbers, at least a 5% inflation rate every year. So every year we wait, it just costs us that much more. So I think that also makes timing critical, that you get the best bang for your buck wherever we start on this process. And obviously, education of the public is going to be huge, because I think even today, there are questions or comments, like Mark mentioned, people say things, and we knew the answers 7 years ago, but the same questions are still coming up.
Right. Yeah, I'm glad Rich is involved in this, because he oversees the website, he oversees the TV programming that we have, because we really have to ramp up the communication side of the house. My fear is that if we don't fully utilize Channel 18, public access, if we don't fully utilize our social media platform, if we don't fully utilize our website and all our capabilities, at the end of the day, we can do a lot of work, but it's going to seem to many people like we're just talking to ourselves. All right? That's why it's good that he's here, because he oversees all that stuff. He can make sure that the community gets more engaged in this.
To that point, under the other business item of the agenda here, I'll comment, I have sketched out a webpage for the committee. It's not published yet. I wanted you guys to meet, and I want to inform you that it's ready to go in one form or another. And maybe I'll just coordinate that through the chairman, and it'll be a topic for discussion upcoming. But you do have that resource. Cape Media Center is here tonight, taking video of the meeting, and we'll get that up. I am looking into how to broaden our Channel 18 presence, and creating a YouTube channel, for instance, to make things more user-friendly, the way people may be used to it today, nowadays. So that's all a work in progress. But as you have ideas and want to get information out, please feel free to contact me, and I'll make sure that a minimum it gets on the website, and we are exploring additional avenues, and perhaps even a get to know your committee type of presentation through the Cape Media Center that we can get broadcast out on the community media channels. So a lot to go on that front.
Just as a follow-up to some of that, I would encourage you to go to the Town of Harwich wastewater. If you go to their website, they actually have a wastewater button that pops up. They have a bunch of buttons on the left for different issues. One of them is a wastewater button, and it brings you to all the postings that they've been doing. But when they were leading up to town meeting articles, we actually did 7-minute presentations for cable programs. And we didn't want to go any longer than 7 minutes because nobody will listen beyond that. But we did topics, key topics. So we did 3 or 4 of them, which received a lot of good feedback. We did some brochures regarding the items. We'll send you the one on connections. As well as documents that have been produced, meeting minutes, all those things are the type of things we put there. So, Rich has drafted something for you, but there's another one that you can compare to. Town of Dennis has some information up and running. So just encourage you to, because you folks are the ones who need to figure out what should go there, what, people, one, for your own information, but 2, what you're hearing from others out there in the community, what they want to hear. And I would tell you, there is no one means. You're going to need multiple methods to communicate this, and it's not a one-time deal.
No.
It's going to have to be continuous.
It's all in progress.
And mentioning that, I think that the coordination between the 3 towns and their message at some point is going to be very important too.
They've been posting the minutes from those subgroup meetings, from the DHY monthly meetings in each of the towns, or it's been sent to them.
So I think, as we go forward with the project, I think the 3 towns saying the same thing to everybody is going to be very important. We don't want one here, one there. And we all mean the same thing, but it doesn't sound like we're saying the same thing.
Yep.
So I think we need to make sure as we get further down the road, that's part of this too.
Fred, I can assure you that that discussion has already happened. When we go to our meetings, we actually talk about this. What are we going to be saying when we go back to our town? It comes up all the time.
Okay.
And I think what we need to do is, what I think is going to be great is there are actually some, I think that, for example, Dennis and Harwich have done some things that we can learn from, and also in terms of messaging and communication as well. I think Dennis has done a great job in their cost recovery plan, figuring out how they're going to pay for things. They've had a lot of public discussion, a lot of public awareness. It's been just by focusing on that for a period of time, it's been able to make people aware of the problem and the various ways to approach dealing with it. And again, they've been very cognizant of that as well. We've kind of created a bit of a messaging problem ourselves a little bit. We call this the Dennis Harwich Yarmouth, community partnership. And people are so used to us using the term wastewater that we decided that we wanted to call this a clean water partnership. We wanted to make the focus on a benefit, a good, a public.
Yeah, we were getting for it.
Public goal, right. This is all about getting the three towns working together to get clean water. And, we've even had some initial discussions about what you call the treatment plant. Do you want to call it a wastewater treatment plant, or do you want to call it a clean water reclamation plant? We need to think through on all of these areas of focus, how we're communicating and how we're talking. And if we can keep this going in the three towns, I think it'll meet your goal in terms of making sure that we're all sort of speaking from the same hymnal.
Yeah, and hopefully the feedback, one of the things I thought was frustrating from the last process was the feedback wasn't very good. We were getting limited feedback and kind of moving forward with what we got the feedback, and it turns out there was a very small portion of what people really thought. We were going in one direction, most of the people actually thought something else, but we didn't know that at the time.
I
think we need to get that also straight.
Yeah, my last point, and then I'll shut up for the rest of the night, is I think the more we're seen as working in collaboration with Barnstable, Dennis, and Harwich to find ways to create efficiencies and savings to work regionally, the extent that we're able to get state funding and federal funding, showing partnerships at those levels, and that there's an approach in terms of how the local community supports this financially. There's been a lot of talk of user fees and flow-oriented costs. I think to the extent to which the local share has got a lot of public involvement and support, I think those are all the ingredients that we're going to need to sort of draw on to help pull this off.
Combination of resources.
Yeah.
So what are our next steps for the next meeting?
Well, what were you proposing? We're going to work on, you said cost recovery is a huge thing, and phasing. So I guess the first thing would be the phasing. Again,
Yeah, I think we
how
need to
work
have a
with Barnstable
discussion on the
as well.
phasing, let you understand how the phasing plan was put together, why it was done that way, and then get your feedback of, is that something you still feel comfortable with, or are there certain areas you want to address differently? That, I think, dovetails in with your feedback on the economic plan. So I think if we address phasing, we can give you the flows by the phases, and if you have your feedback on the economic plan at that meeting, that will cover a lot of territory. And then we can also have a debrief off the DHY and MFN meeting.
Yeah,
on the
I guess
24th.
another question I have that probably would come up too is the idea of the treatment plant to be scalable, so it would be built as this much, and then as the flow increases through the phases, it would just be like we talked about originally?
Yeah, it was always built to be expandable, yes.
Anybody else have any questions? Any comments on what we should be talking about next?
Just one thing, can we get contact information?
I was going to mention that, I think, yeah.
So I left it off until your meeting here, but I'll work through the chairman perhaps and just expand that document you have to include email addresses and phone numbers perhaps.
Just be aware of open meeting rules and how you communicate with people that you don't create a problem.
So that brings up a good question. If we want to convey something for the next meeting or to this committee, who should we direct that to?
It could go through me or it could go directly to David. I'm sure he and I are going to have a lot of contact moving forward. And I don't want to stand in the way if anybody has a question of him. If he doesn't mind dealing directly with committee members, that's fine with me. It's up to him.
Well, I would recommend that the two of you be the points of contact.
That's kind of my thought.
All right.
If somebody talks to me or him, we're both communicating and we can make sure everything comes together.
That's fine.
Also, I think it's important that if we need to really look at how we get out into the public with this, because it's great we put it on social media and do this, but last time, I remember a lot of the talk came from people who never even got involved with this until it started hitting town meeting or voting. And it was,
Pretty ugly.
well, yeah, it came down to one thing. What are they talking about? What's this? What's a CLF? You know, if people don't know there's something hanging over them, they're not gonna, they're still gonna put their hand in the sand.
And some people that
It's
do
gonna
it
happen.
didn't believe it.
Well, absolutely. These are questions, these are things we're gonna have to turn people around on through the next,
Good, yeah. Some people
14
say
months.
it's been 7 years, nothing's happened with them, so we really don't believe it.
Right.
Guaranteed that's gonna happen.
Absolutely, Kurt.
Can I suggest to sort of take Rob's concern and turn it into an action item? I think it would be helpful for everyone to identify a list of community groups that we should be engaging with, we should have outreach with, maybe identifying points of contact. This is good. I don't want this to take it the bad way, but there's a little bit of this is a campaign. Let's put it this way, an education campaign. So at the very least, if we can identify all the groups we should be communicating with, interacting with. Tom, I know you're on a bunch of them. Lee, others, put together a list of the groups that you think we need to be communicating with. That's one start. And then one of the things we can do is we may be at a point where we're going to want an email newsletter. We may want to have a partnership with the Chamber of Commerce, and maybe they can help distribute the information of this group. I mean, it won't take much to build partnerships with a lot of these groups, so every time there's a development or something that we need to get out, there are ways to do that, so.
Yeah, 'cause it, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, I think having a list of groups that we can try to network with and communicate with, I would put right up there on our list of things to do. And that means groups that also will take speakers to periodically show up and update them and talk to them.
So I think the other thing is, we need to nail down the timing of the different phases of what we're going to do. So, people say, well, if you're putting the pipe in the ground today in Route 28, when do we actually hook into it? When is the plant going to be ready to accept products? So I think as we go forward and different things become priorities, the message is going to change a little bit as we go. Okay, this year we're talking about the pipe in the ground before the DOT comes in and rebuilds the road.
I'm going to buy you a cup of coffee and we can have a nice debate over that whole approach. Because I believe you have a ton of stuff that you can talk about right now.
Oh, we do, but I think as we go forward, we're going to need to tune the message to whatever is happening at that time, or what's the next thing in line.
I'm always grabbing a cup of coffee with him.
One of my suggestions would not overload them at the very start. I think that when you go, this is what we're doing, taking it by that piece.
You can start with generalizations, and then when you get closer to
People
it,
need to
take a
know,
task.
we have to do something this time. This is not like
We'll
since
get to it.
1960s.
But it's also good to
gotta do it.
ask people for input.
Right.
Ask them for input.
What would you do?
Huh?
What would you do?
Exactly, what would you do? These are the options that we're wrestling with. What do you think? What's your preference?
And then have the answers ready when they make their comment.
Yeah, exactly. You have to
You say this, yeah, that's a great idea, or that won't work because, and
Right.
know what you're talking about when,
Really.
because we're talking about the same issues and the same answers
Exactly.
all these years later.
You bet.
It's just you have more pressure this time.
Exactly.
Mr. Chair, if I could, wastewater is obviously a big topic of discussion, and you're going to have many, many meetings that are focused on that and all the components, but you asked about what else to talk about, and the charge was written very broadly for this committee, so wastewater is certainly, first and foremost, but there's drinking water, fresh water, stormwater, reclaimed water. CDM Smith did a great job of putting together a flyer that we've distributed pretty widely, and we should probably bring back to this committee as well, focusing on all those aspects of water. Here it is right here. And so when the time is appropriate to discuss with your committee, we're happy to bring forward all those topics. And there's great work happening on all of those areas currently in Yarmouth as well. So just something to keep in mind for future meetings and future topics.
I agree. Anybody else have any more comments? So I'd like to move to adjourn.
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you all for your time.